I'm not going to go into the WTO issues of special and differential treatment. Just a point to take note of, and I'm not sure. I'm not technically up to date with the going on in the WTO. In fact, Felix might be the better person to actually comment on this. But just one point is that South Africa has already advanced far quicker than any of the other countries on the WTO forum in terms of its special and differential treatment. So I don't know where we are right now, but it could be some. I think that was just something that South Africa actually progressed a lot quicker than a lot of the other developing countries. In fact, and it's because of its history of GATT and the WTO. South Africa was never seen as a developing country. It was and always progressed a lot quicker than other developing countries in that respect. I don't know whether that actually addresses your question. On Brazil, I've got the most up-to-date readings on Brazil, and I don't disagree at all. And we saw what happened now with President Rousseff, what she did in the last week to try and curb the current account deficit. And I think she actually surprised all her critics and the world at large. I think Brazil has got a huge problem looming in its current account deficit. But you must remember that Brazil, that will not detract from Brazil's role in the global political economy. I know it's often quite controversial to say in these parts of the world, but Brazil is seen and will be a leading country of the future and will be at the center of all of this because of its economic size, because of what it's done in terms of building a middle class, and because of most of all now what lies ahead in 2014 and 2016 and the pre-sale deposits. All of this combined. It just depends on whether the current government can actually undertake the policy and management, or the management of the economy in such a way that will be a little bit more, that will cut back a little bit on spending and actually try and develop more continuity in that regard. But we can debate Brazil for hours. It is a very, very complex scenario, and I won't shy away from the fact that there are some enormous challenges that lie ahead for Brazil going forward. Do you want to comment on that as well?
No, I just asked a question.
Oh, okay. Okay, so must I speed up? I do agree again, the labour division, it is really very much Asia versus the rest, and that's something that we have to learn, and that's going to be, but that's another layer of the divisions in the global political economy, and that's something that we could debate really around what dynamic markets are. They offer different virtues, and each one is different. That is a very interesting point, and when we look at multinational corporations, it almost, I wouldn't go as far as to say it sickens me, but it really does upset me when you talk to, I work with a lot of companies, and they say, we're trying to build an emerging market strategy. There's no such thing as an emerging market strategy. There's no straitjacket approach to any dynamic market or emerging market, and each one is going to be different, and I think we've got to distinguish those. We are going to be seeing dynamic markets fragment into various clusters of countries that are doing relatively well and others that aren't over the next 2 or 3 years as people start understanding a little bit more about the intricacies of what goes on in dynamic markets and the companies and the individuals that are emerging out of them. Just in terms of the policy in South Africa, and I think you've been something about the consistencies and the contradictions in South African policy going forward, and where I see BRIC going. These are huge discussions in South Africa. They're hugely debated, hotly debated issues in South Africa, and where this is a positive sign in terms of South Africa's progress recently is that they are discussed and they are debated quite openly. Where we are concerned is that for a long time, business and government have been in parallel universes talking a different language, and most of which has been lost in translation along the way in terms of our engagement with Africa and the rest of the world. On the 10th of March, President Zuma in his State of the Nation address highlighted the need to create jobs and using the private sector as a means, as a vehicle to do just that. So while he didn't have any clear plan, he was criticized for not having a very clear plan. At least he has actually held out the white handkerchief, if you like, and he is engaging now on the 10th of March with representatives from the private sector to actually see how we can actually go forward in this. And this will not only be on a national level, this will be in terms of creating better facilities and enabling environments for South African companies on the African continent. I believe that we need to have a greater or a high degree of diplomacy diplomacy from the South African government across the African continent to assist it in much the same way that Lula has worked with his private sector on the African continent. I think it would be a good model. I believe it's a good model that South Africa can actually embrace. In terms of the G20, just very quickly, one of the concerns that I thought about when South Africa was invited to join BRIC was, what does this mean for the G20? And I don't know if it really means very much. I know that Argentina is a member of the G20, so it would be of interest to you. But I believe that it might operate in much the same way as what IPSA did in the G20 before, which did very, very little in terms of, you might think there might be little alliance groups that develop within the G20. That might be the case, but I seriously doubt it given the inconsistencies among the BRIC countries. The future of the G20, really the G20 is the next Bretton Woods type of system, and perhaps BRIC shouldn't be seen in the same light as that. BRIC is more of a kind of a small little cluster of countries. The G20 is the future of where we're going in terms of IMF type of Bretton Woods type of systems that we had after the previous financial crisis. So I think there's a great future for the G20 if it can be managed appropriately. Oh, and very importantly, the G20 also brings together those mature and developed markets with those that are emerging and dynamic.
Yeah, well, if I could just ask two questions live. First of all, thank you very much. A very interesting and stimulating address, as per normal. I just really got 2 points, and they're not really related. The first is, given that we're in Buenos Aires, on the same degree of latitude as Cape Town, more or less, do you think, or don't you think, that Argentina meets what you described as a gateway country in terms of Latin-speaking South America? Let's just put Brazil to one side. It'd be very different and exceptional in the South American terms. Do you think Argentina has any of the attributes of a gateway country to the rest of the South American continent, or not, just broadly speaking? The second point is this. There's a very interesting chap, I want you to meet him here, I'm sure he's known to many people in the audience, called Jorge Fontevecchia, who's the head of Perfil, which is also a major media group, and I'm sure you won't mind me quoting him, since if I said it was my own idea, it would be very clever, and then I'd be accused of being a plagiarist, which it's not a good thing for politicians or diplomats to be. But I've had a few meetings with Jorge during my time, and he draws a very interesting series of circles that meet. And he said basically there are 3 countries of huge consequence in the world, and the 3 are, and in terms of BRIC, there are 2 of them on BRIC and the rest aren't. He said it's China, the United States, of course, in your determination is a panda country, and not an Indian minor country, and sorry, I'll just I have a really loud voice, but they won't be able to be translation properly. Thanks very much. The United States, China, and Brazil. And the reason for this is that they're the only 3 countries in the world which have $1 trillion plus economies, populations of 200 million or more, and a land mass of more than probably 3 million square kilometers. All the other countries that you think are very important, India and maybe Russia, fall short on one of those 3 criteria. It's quite an interesting way of looking at the world. So it then gets to my next point, which is this. I mean, obviously for the purpose of discussion, debate, it's quite sexy to say the developed economies are sclerotic and the developing countries are dynamic, and it's good things that we are both from dynamic or developing countries to say that. But actually, if you look, and it's not in that thing that I mentioned, Germany. Germany is an advanced, developed, sclerotic country, if you like. It's got the best manufacturing export sector in the world. The United States, I'm a little bit of a skeptic of writing off the economic prospect of a country that's producing, 1/4 of the GDP of the world. So I ask that because these are very interesting and indeed important concepts that we're discussing here. But you can skin a cat in so many different ways. You use the Ponte Vecchio model, or you'll end up with 3 countries. You use the dynamic market model, you probably should put Germany in there. So it's interesting, and you know, Jim O'Neill and Goldman Sachs have done South Africa a favor, and certainly Brazil, Russia, India, and China. But you know, what does this mean going forward? Is the question.
Can I respond to that?
Ya tienes unos minutos para responder.
Okay.
Se nos va terminando el tiempo.
Okay. Okay. As always, my ambassador stretches me to the absolute limits. Argentina is a gateway country or economy to South and Latin America. I would say probably South America. Your region is really split between the two. Is split by the Panama Canal. I think South Africa and Argentina, I think there's a lot to be learned. I think there's a huge comparative case to be made, because and for both good and bad reasons. When we first started talking about dynamic markets at Gibbs, and when I did a number of interviews and debates much like this one, many people would ask me, is South Africa a dynamic market? Because then, being South African and in the middle of South Africa, we'd immediately have to say, yes, well, we are, you know, look at us, we must be dynamic. South Africa in many respects has got the characteristics of a mature economy. We haven't grown very well over the last 10 to 15 years. Our competitiveness has been in decline. Don't worry, I'm going to come back with some good ones in a moment, some positive points. But our competitiveness, and by measurements of the World Economic Forum's competitiveness index or report, we have been in competitive decline since 1996, really, literally. Moving down all these places, and as a small or medium-sized economy, we need to really be as competitive as possible, as does Argentina. And most importantly, and this is something that I always emphasize, as part of a country's competitiveness in a dynamic world, as a dynamic market, part of that competitiveness is around human development, which is essentially, we're not going to go directly according to the UN definition, but education and healthcare. South Africa has been in decline in those areas, but there are aspects of the South African economy which would suggest that it is a dynamic market and it has got a great future ahead of it, and I mentioned some of it around the private sector. And I believe again that South Africa has got that restless energy. You feel it on the streets of Johannesburg. You literally walk around and you go to work and you rush to work and you rush home and you think you're going to get mugged on the way home if you like, or maybe hijacked, and you get into your house and you slam your slam door shut and you jump in and you switch the lights on and you go, whew, I've arrived home safely, fantastic. And in New Zealand you get home and you just have another boring day in New Zealand. So anyway, so that's one of the reasons. Oh yeah, of course. So the point is that we have got that energy, and I think that it's up to us now, whether we are the government or the private sector. And I emphasize again the private sector. We are very quick to criticize governments in South Africa. The private sector is very quick to criticize governments in South Africa for their lack of participation, or the lack of policy formulation around enabling the private sector to flourish and to be competitive. We don't create a very competitive environment, but I do believe that it's also up to the private sector to make it a little bit more clear as to what is required, and actually participate a little bit more effectively with the South African government that has a huge responsibility now beyond South Africa in areas of economic development. Now going back to Argentina, I think Argentina suffers from very similar traits. There's a stifling environment here around the culture of doing business, around the policy making, and around labor legislation, etc., that prevents it from doing certain things, that will prevent it from becoming a gateway economy for the rest of South America. It's a hugely important and hugely relevant economy, and it's got everything in the ground. I mean, there was an old story that you throw a football boot into the ground and out would pop a mini. You know, it was one of those. There's brilliant pockets of innovation across the country. You've got a highly sophisticated and educated population, still with some of the highest literacy rates in the world, or certainly in the region and even in the world. But it's just been you know, they used to say about Brazil in the 80s, 90s, 70s, 80s and 90s that Brazil is the country of the future and it always will be. I think that title is now, and I know, but I'm among friends here, and everybody knows that if I could live anywhere else besides South Africa in the world, it would be Argentina. But that title of the country of the future and always will be has now been assumed very much by Argentina. It's a huge concern, and there's a paradigm shift that has to take place in South Africa, in Argentina, as it does in South Africa, to actually assume this whole dynamism and to become a gateway economy. It's up to the people, it's up to the policymakers, and it's up to the development of infrastructure, hard and soft infrastructure, that will actually be. So, to answer your question in short, I know I've taken a very wide berth around this, but to answer your question, yes, Argentina has got the capacity to be, or the ability to be a gateway economy. That's what it should be. That's what it can be, and that's what it should be. But it's really going to be up to whether they can actually marry the ambitions of the private sector and government policy and policy toward the rest of the region. There has to be far more engagement with the rest of the region and far less rivalry with their neighboring countries. And let's not forget that it is important over and above Brazil because of the issues of language and culture. I think that is a huge thing that is often overlooked. So that is really Argentina's place, as it is South Africa's place in Africa. Argentina could well be the gateway economy and should actually design its policy framework in such a way to actually capitalize on that. But this is also a huge debate. We could go into this for hours. I love the idea of this, the constellation. You know, these constellations of countries or circles of countries, the three most important countries into the future are always fascinating. And we can, I mean, and that's why we had so much fun coming up with the dynamic market concept. You can imagine us sitting around and deciding on 12 most important economies. I do agree about Germany. Germany is interesting and it is innovating, Germany is almost an exception, and I agree with you with regard to the United States. I think one thing that I should have mentioned was that dynamic markets, while the United States might not be at the forefront of our research and teaching around dynamic markets and GIBS, I certainly see certain areas in the United States as being pockets of dynamism. So there's going to be, and I wrote an article about a year ago or 18 months ago of is the United States in decline? And the simple answer was no, because of areas of higher education and because the United States has been here before and they have been able to reinvent themselves before and place themselves in a competitive position vis-a-vis other countries in the global political economy. That is why the United States is and will remain relevant for many years to come. The Chinese economy might overtake the United States economy by 2030, according to Goldman Sachs's projections. But the United States will remain a highly innovative and competitive economy beyond 2030. It's you know, it's not a France or maybe even a Japan. Japan's even starting to reshape itself. But again, the United States is going to continue to be innovative, and there will be little areas that will have to reinvent itself. And the whole idea of creative destruction, you know, it's this economic concept of creative destruction, I think applies within the United States, and because of its size and diversity, part of that creative destruction will actually take place within the United States, whereas there will be certain little areas, geographical areas or pockets of innovation that will rise up after those big trees have fallen, so that there will be green shoots of new and innovative growth in the United States.
Muchas gracias. La